The judges were biased toward musical acts. Through an awareness of intersectionality, the careers of those complicit to cover up were blighted. The reforms threatened his autocratic power. A more progressive social policy, a populist leader, gave him a speculative glance.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the very first keynote of the Transmediale 2018 Face Value Conference Program. We have the honor to listen to Françoise Vergès and on the politics of forgetfulness. It's going to be moderated by Anna-Sophie Springer. And I would like to thank, first of all, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung for supporting this event and this year's conference program. Of course, our speaker and the topic will be introduced more in full by Anna-Sophie. But I'd like to add a few words on how this event fits into the overall framework of the Face Value program. And I would like also to add that the conference has been curated by Daphne Dragona, who is sitting somewhere over there, I think. And, well, she's introducing so many events that we decided also to do a little bit of a division of labor, so that's why I'm standing here tonight. So the conference program, of course, works with the general framework of the face value theme, which, among other things, talks about the underlying systems of value and valuation that have led to this current moment also of increasing polarization and conflict, the rise of populist politics, communicational cultures that are kind of characterized by reactionary modes of interaction. And often this is seen as a crisis of values, such as a failure in Western democracies and their values of, or narratives also of progress, not least technological such. But with this festival and this theme, we also try to see this in relation to a more deeper structural crisis of Western societies and the economic foundation on which it has been built, also with a long-reaching legacy of colonialism and extractivism. And this is where tonight's keynote speaker comes in with her work on the racial capitalocene, I'll never learn to say that, which deals also with this intimate connection between capitalism and racism and also the need to decolonize knowledge. Instead, as is often the case, to apply a kind of solutionist quick thinking. Someone that can further introduce and provide relevant questions to Vergès is Anna-Sophie Springer. She's an independent exhibition maker, writer and editor, currently doing a PhD at the Center for Research Architecture of Goldsmiths. She directs also the publishing platform K-Verlag, which together with Etienne Turpin publishes the wonderful, I would say, series Intercalations, paginated exhibition series. I think it has also a collaboration here with HKW. They have dedicated volumes to diverse topics such as libraries, archipelagos, forests, decapitated economies, and I think even ornithology. I'd urge you to check them out at the HKW bookshop. So now I'm very happy to welcome Anna-Sophie Springer, also because it's a kind of a return. Anna-Sophie worked for the Transmediale in the past as an editor, and now it's great to see you back here as a participant on stage to introduce tonight's keynote event. Please, welcome both. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. That was a really lovely introduction. Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first keynote lecture of this year's Transmediale Face Value. And as this evening's moderator of Françoise Vergès' keynote, Politics of Forgetfulness, I'm really honored to introduce this inspirational thinker to you now. But first of all, again, Christopher, Daphne, and Transmediale team, thank you very much for this invitation, and a very warm welcome to you, Françoise, sitting down here for the next 10 minutes. So quoting from the festival program, Transmediale 2018 Face Value aims to, quote, challenge the impulse to judge things by their immediate appearance and instead look at issues that might be less visible but nevertheless are running deep and across, end quote. And there's really no better speaker for this first keynote than Françoise Vergès. She's one of the most distinguished thinkers and activists of decolonial methodologies and has been exploring the underlying connections between intersectional issues of race, capitalism, imperialism, and gender for decades. Her perspectival changes make us see below and beyond, yet by granting these undercurrents their undeniable existence and relevance for confronting contemporary forms of violence. She's incredibly skilled in excavating forgotten historical moments and power dynamics. She tells stories in which these marginalized events are interwoven and in tension with each other in such a manner that they become constituent for conceiving the past differently, in more complex, more complicated, but also more complete ways. Her work is especially impactful regarding notions such as inheritance, in the sense of carefully parsing whose stories have been or have not been listened to for a long time, and demanding the genuine need for breaking these conventions. Born in Paris, she was raised on the island of La Réunion, not too far from Madagascar and Mauritius, where she comes from a communist, anti-colonialist, and feminist family. And indeed, her writing often takes this autobiographical cartography as a narrative starting point. Still a teenager, she moved to Algeria to live with relatives active in the anti-colonial liberation movement. And throughout the 1970s and 80s, she worked as a feminist and anti-racist journalist and editor in France. In 1995, she completed her PhD at Berkeley, and one of the results of this research period is the 1999 book Monsters and Revolutionaries, Colonial Family Romance and Métissage. Meanwhile, she's authored 9 more books and countless essays and articles on post-colonial theory, creolization, psychoanalysis, slavery, and economies of predation. In the early 2000s, Françoise Vergès taught at Sussex University and Goldsmiths in London. Between 2004 and 2012, she was also first vice president and then the president of the Committee for the Memory of Slavery in France. These days, she holds the position of Chair of Global Souths at the Collège d'études mondiales at the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. Notably, she's a scholar with an active and multidisciplinary approach. She's a political scientist, author, documentary filmmaker, and the curator of several exhibitions confronting the lasting legacies of slavery. One example of the latter is the project Slaves at the Louvre, an invisible humanity in the context of the Paris Triennial Intense Proximity in 2012. Here, she presented a selection of 17th and 18th century paintings from the Louvre's collection, depicting apparently unsuspecting, typical portraits of modern bourgeoisie life. But by asking, what reveals itself despite the desire to conceal, the project argued for the ubiquitous evidence and discernibly embodied memory of slavery, plantation labor, and exploitative trade networks, even if the Western narratives of progress and carefree consumption habitually prefer to forget these inherent ties to colonization. This curatorial intervention significantly troubled the commodiousness of bourgeois subjectivity by no longer allowing not to see, to forget what is referenced in these very images, and that is the material references to the coercive and violent conditions of the production of coffee, cotton, sugar, and tobacco in the tropics. As Grada Quilomba states in her book Plantation Memories about Everyday Racism, one cannot simply forget and one cannot avoid remembering. This intervention, so the slavery in the Louvre, this intervention in the presentation of one of the most reputable European art museums remains a touchstone example of post-colonial museology. The project confronted the politics of forgetfulness inherent in racialized capitalism with relatively simple means by interrupting the privileged narrative's refusal to face the economies of predation and fabrication of disposable people it is based upon. So more recently, Françoise Vergès has been voicing the necessity to intensify the ways in which notions of climate change and with it the Anthropocene must be politicized. Here, one of her central questions has been, quote, what methodology is needed to write a history of the environment that includes slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism from the standpoint of those who were made into cheap objects of commerce, their bodies as objects renewable through wars, capture, enslavement, fabricated as disposable people whose lives do not matter, end quote. Specifically, in the context of the Anthropocene discourse, she has asked whether, quote, studies on the emergence of the Anthropocene have addressed the role of race in its making, end quote, thereby underscoring, as in her previous work also, that nature is not somehow free of the power relations of society, but that much rather, even the established conceptions of the environment are based on systemic, structural, racial inequalities, and that this has produced much less a climate of environmental justice, but one of environmental racism. The French sociologist Razmik Kötschouan states this similarly in his book Nature is a Battlefield, where he writes, quote, there's the idea that nature is a universal good, accessible to all regardless of gender, race, or class. Yet on closer inspection, we see that nothing could be further from the truth, end quote. It is in this context that Françoise Vergès now dedicates herself to what she has termed the racial capitalocene, and thus qualifying a term already used to critique the assumption of universalism and species responsibility at play in the Anthropocene concept. One of her main points here is to take seriously the fact that the environment and capitalism are the product of the domination of minorities and people from the South, which is to say that notions such as nature and value are contaminated by European imperialism, colonial genocide, and the ideologies of white supremacy. A second point, then, is her claim that, and I quote again, we must integrate this long memory of colonialism's impact and the fact that destruction in the colonial era becomes visible in the post-colonial era, end quote. So making her case for the racial capitalocene is a perspective, then, that exposes what is so wrong with seeing cheap nature as bounty and understanding capitalist production as anything but waste production. Her work problematizes disposability and externalization, that is, when the destructions of lives and contamination of ecosystems just isn't included in the calculations of productivity and value creations, but outsourced as something for others to deal with, if not, to die from. So in tonight's keynote lecture, The Politics of Forgetfulness, Françoise Vergès will take us on a journey that departs from the question, what are the affected territories, populations, and workforces that tend to be forgotten in discussions about technological progress? Arguing that the colonial trauma is memorized in the sense that it is not and cannot be forgotten, and by turning to anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist methodologies, she calls for the freedom to dream other pasts and imagine other futures than those suggested by racialized capitalism. So please join me in welcoming on the stage Françoise Vergès.
Good evening. Well, thank you, Anna-Sophie. Thank you for inviting me. I'm not sure that I have more to say after, what you say. Almost, I'm not really sure that I should be on stage. Perhaps we should start the discussion, maybe more productive. So, forgetfulness, it will not be necessarily about forgetfulness tonight. It's not, and when I say forgetfulness, and Anna-Sophie reminded, it's not, what we need to forget in our own life, but the way in which, in our daily life, we are made to forget. We are organized so that we forget. And the way in which the narrative, national or institutional, are constructed so that entire chapters are forgotten. How even space and time are built, spatiality, temporality are built so that there is a certain way, a periodicity that is imposed. And therefore, even the story of emancipation must be said in a vocabulary of defeat and victory and turning point, even though we know that the road to freedom is long and difficult. And I have been, mostly because in France right now there is a 1968, right? It's everywhere. But so, of course, it's celebrated as a very Franco-French thing in terms of, this was a turning point. And so I've been really more and more thinking of getting away with that kind of vocabulary, and the vocabulary even of victory and defeat, that impose a certain view, a militaristic vocabulary on struggle. And even rethinking defeat, because I was thinking, well, the history of the oppressed, if we look at it, it's a long history of defeat, if we were looking in terms of defeat and victory. And if we do look at it as a long road to freedom, with effectively setback, because the enemy will never, open the door, and that we have to fight back and push back constantly, then the periodicity and even the narrative will be changed. So this is what I mean also, being in constant awareness about what is forgotten and why. Tonight, also, my talk may appear a little fragmented, incomplete, perhaps even sometimes incoherent. But because I do not see, keynote speeches as something that I arrive with a complete form of thought. My thought is not complete, It's never really. And also because I want to stay, as Donna Haraway put it, how do we stay in trouble when we speak? How do we keep, when we speak and when we present something, how do we keep alive the trouble we are in? The fact that effectively the ground are constantly shifting, and to be aware of that. The second point also about the political forgetfulness, there is a strategy quite often, and I say it, of talking about forgotten chapter and the need to integrate them in the narrative, or to integrate, voices in the museum or voices in the institution. And in the meantime, the frame of the narrative or the institution, the way the structure of the institution are not questioned. And it's not enough to have a chapter on slavery or a chapter on colonialism in the textbook or a gallery on colonialism in the museum to change effectively what is going on in terms of power and to understand how power works. It does not mean that this should not be done, but it should mean that we have to be aware, as Audre Lorde say, that the master house will not be destroyed by the master tools, which does not mean that we don't have to do anything, but which means that we know that every time we do something, it can be in fact being contributing to forgetfulness. So this is why another point I want to do in introduction is sometimes I don't really know how to answer the way in which, the speed in which capitalism and consumption can really take words very fast, a movement very fast, and commodify them or transforming them. And that I'm not sure how to respond to that beside, saying it and trying to describe it. And this gap, it's something that I've been trying to think, but without answer. But I was thinking, to give you an example, at the Golden Globe, you saw the movement Me Too, and all the women arriving in black dresses, the actresses, and Meryl Streep bringing the leader of the National Alliance of Domestic Workers, and Meryl Streep she came with Tarana Burke, the black woman who had started the Me Too movement in African American community. But that's what we saw in the media. But in fact, what I saw afterwards, that same evening, Laura Dern, who is one of the leaders of the Me Too movement among actresses of Hollywood, she put on her Instagram account a picture of the Bulgari watch that she has, on which she asked Bulgari to put Me Too around like that. And she said, Bulgari is with us, in the movement, Me Too. Yes, thank you, Bulgari. And Natalie Portman opened an Instagram account to support the Me Too movement, and she was right away congratulated by Dior, saying, thank you, Natalie Portman, for wearing a Dior black dress to the Golden Globe, and of course Dior is supporting Me Too. So they was not even starting the movement, that it was already reabsorbed. And I was, almost baiting with my friend that in 2 years at the Oscar, we're going to have a film on Me Too that effectively will go. So there was this constant, like colonization, really, and I think we have to rethink the term colonization, how it's an important notion, how it's absolutely a notion which is not just historical, does not belong just to the 19th century of colonizing land, but as a process of a constant need for capitalism and white supremacy to colonize, to invade, to integrate. Otherwise, everything that emerged, and the capacity has been increasing thanks to all the tool of publicity, communication, and social network. And we do know that there is another side to that, but nonetheless, that capacity is for me a question that I want also to put tonight, to say that effectively this is why also my presentation is incomplete and fragmented. So talking really about, tonight I wanted to talk about 3 points. I was also told that I should, because I think we have to leave by 7:30, and I wanted to have some discussion, so I will talk for half an hour, so to give at least 30 minutes for exchange. So in other words, if my presentation appears fragmentary, unfinished, partial, it is because I find it very difficult at the moment to present a full analysis of racial capitalocene. And the speed effectively through which everything can become a commodity is very much a question for me. Quite often it produces a sense of powerlessness, a feeling that we cannot fight against that machine. Yesterday, again, during a debate on rape and colonialism, some people were asking me, but what can we do? Should we ask for more laws? Is the answer to have more laws? And I'm constantly resisting that feeling of powerlessness and despair. And even, the despair, I want to rethink it and to reintroduce it and to perhaps thinking what is despair as, in fact, a political sentiment for revolt, rather than effectively despair as a melancholia. So thinking racial capitalism requires to grasp so many things, but more importantly, to confront the utter destruction of the habitat of billions of people in the world, and to wonder even how can it be repaired? Can it be repaired? And if the objective is reparation in that case. So Promethean thinking, inseparable for me from, neoliberal capitalism and technological individualism, the sense that, everything can be saved, that man will always find a technological solution, that Prometheus will be there. And it's, of course, an ideology that was widely shared by countries like the Soviet Union yesterday and today India and China. So it's not really, does not belong to the West. It came from the West, but it became, in fact, a world ideology. Which also bring the promise that happiness can be reached while destroying the very source that produces that form of happiness. So the happiness is the promise, but at the same moment where the source of that happiness are being destroyed under the eyes. The idea also that the planet is infinite insofar that it must serve a limitless desire of the individual. It presents a world in which desire can be fulfilled regardless of the consequence. Desire and freedom are effectively the two things that should guide our life. And of course, there is no class, no gender, and no race in that discourse, which is why also minorities and women have questioned that ideology. And if we look at the history of racialized environment in the 20th century, I will not look historically further. I mean, we could do that, but there will be no time. We see that already in the 1960s, in fact. Let me see. I'm sorry, because you know the rector there, so printing totally troubled me. I never know. Sorry. Okay. In the 1960s, Latino farm workers were the first to raise this connection, to show the connection between race, capitalism, and gender, when they denounced, the condition of work in the field of California, with the organization led by Cesar Chavez, including they asked for protection from toxic pesticide. And then in 1967 also, African-American students who opposed a city dump and protested against, in 1979, against a landfill in Houston. These were the first moments, so in the late 1960s, when ethnic minority started to show, and even though this is not in the usual narrative of ecological awareness and emergence, but it was there. In 1987, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States was published by the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, an African-American church in the United States. It was the first publication that showed that race was the single most important factor in determining where toxic waste facilities were situated in the United States, and that the situation of this facility in communities of color was intentional, and it was a result of local, state, and federal land use policies. The report demonstrated, I quote, that 3 out of every 5 Black and Hispanic Americans live in community with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. 20 years later, the United Church of Christ, the same organization, published a new report confirming its first finding, saying, I quote, that people of color make up the majority of those living in host neighborhood within 3 kilometers of the nation hazardous waste facility. Racial and ethnic disparity are prevalent through the country. Similar studies in India, South Asia, South America, Africa, and Europe demonstrated a global pattern on environmental racism and the way in which state and multinational have been avoiding environmental justice. Looking back at the matrix between race, capitalism, and environmental destruction in the 20th century, Paula Hebron and Anna Sting have written that the Cold War brought a new meaning to the peculiar configuration of class, race, and gender that has created what they call the Anthropocene. Racialized climate change and environmental destruction bore the mark of the Cold War, they argue, because a particular, I quote, a particular and peculiar set of gender standards and racial exclusion emerged, making modernization as we know it, and instituted a regime of separation between safety and waste spaces through mobilizing race and gender. They say that the US suburb home became a model for a white space of strict patriarchal and gender, racial and gender role. And I was thinking when we did that, of the fact that we called, during that time when you have so many nuclear testing around the world that were externalized by your own power, France state did its nuclear test in Algeria, then in the Pacific Island. The US and the Brits did it in the Pacific Island, which are totally destroyed now. Externalization, racialization of destruction. I was thinking that the family that Hebron and Singh are talking about was called the nuclear family, which I think it's quite interesting that the nuclear family, the white nuclear family, became effectively the model totally opposed to the racialized woman-led family, which became effectively a site of criminality and deviance. Further, they say the Cold War enlarge the human experience of the biosphere by encouraging research and exploration in previously neglected crannies, such as the polar region, the ocean floor, and the upper atmospheres. Politic of colonization, dispossession, and appropriation associated with 19th century history took a new meaning, demonstrating the importance of colonization. A connection then can be made between the Western conception of nature as cheap and the global organization of a cheap, racialized, and disposable workforce, I say, given the conception of nature as constant capital and the fact that the organizer of the capitalist world system appropriated black labor power as constant capital. It was in the same moment, in fact. Writing the story of the environment from the standpoint of those who were made into cheap objects of commerce, made into nature, living in a nature that has to be tamed and disciplined, brings to light the story of bodies fabricated as objects, renewed through war, capture, and enslavement, fabricated as disabled people, and of nature, also as a source of infinite wealth, replenishing itself without human action, or transformed as a source of infinite wealth through bonded work. In other words, starting from the climate and environment as colonial project, being reconfigured in relation with new interests in capitalism and imperialism, make climate and environment a political question connected with gender and race. So this is how I see, for me, racial capitalocene. That is, capitalocene has been suggested by sociologist Jason Moore, who criticized the term of Anthropocene, saying that it's as if all the humanities is responsible for what's happening, whereas it's capitalism, which is very responsible, colonialism. And it's Jason Moore who suggests this idea of cheap nature in the 16th century that emerged in the 16th century, with his view by Europe of a world, their nature made for them, that they could effectively loot it and extract from. But I had to Jason Moore remark the idea of cheap labor, and that both went together in the 16th century. The fact that nature was a source of limitless wealth, but that also Africa became a source of limitless body to bonded workforce. And beside that, I want also to push further and bring it also the question of reproduction of life. I mean, the feminist question that has been usually totally forgotten by historians and analysts of capitalism over the emergence of capitalism with slave trade and slavery. The fact that for centuries, Europe went to Africa to capture and buy millions of Africans, so almost for 4th century, 15 million. And the fact that, of course, this was based to the invisible source of production by women, that African women gave birth to these Africans who were then sold into slavery. So by bringing back also this question that was so much a very important feminist question in the 60s and 70s, what place of social reproduction is in capitalism? It was, so as some of you may remember, it was around domestic labor and the invisible domestic labor, and also the fact that women, of course, bear children and take care of children. But even there, in this feminist theory, these are the rational organization of the production of life was put aside, or focus of what happened in the plantation or after. And for me, I want to bring it back to that moment that Jason Moore or Silvia Federici or others talk about, this 16th century moment of cheap labor, cheap nature, but also of this invisibility of social reproduction by African women, that it was a source. Europe knew every ship that was sent to Africa had to be filled with 200 to 300 bodies, and this body, a woman had bore them and had made a living being that could be sold and sent to the global circulation of bonded labor. So this is what I mean by racial capitalocene, of thinking of all these different elements, and not just the question of, of what we see that the world, that the pollution and the question of hair, but the way in which extraction is not just about extraction of the earth, but also extraction from the body, from the racialized body, female or male. So that's what I meant by that. Then I want to move to something else, for the last 15 minutes, to talk about a site that I think is it's totally forgotten, has been forgotten in anti-colonial texts, and quite often in among post-colonial thinkers, and it's not so much either in talk about climate change and Anthropocene or capitalocene. It's the sea. And for me, the seas are a story also of dispossession, enclosure, and racialization. Let me introduce that part with an excerpt of the poem by a South African woman poet, Koleka Putuma, and the poem is called Water. I quote, "For you, the ocean is for surfboard, boats, and tan, and all the cool stuff you do under there in your bathing suit and goggles. But we have come to be baptized here. We have come to steer the other world here. We have come to cleanse ourselves here. We have come to connect our living to the dead here. Our respect for water is what you have termed fear. The audacity to tread and murder us over water, then mock us for being scared of it. The audacity to arrive by water and invade us." So that sentence, the audacity to tread and murder us over water, I want to use it to introduce this idea of the sea as a space of cheap nature and cheap labor, and how effectively seas and ocean have to be reappropriated in our decolonial theory. They have been largely neglected, as I say, by anti-colonial thinkers and by feminists as well, even though bodies of water, seas and ocean have been central to the history of slavery, colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism, instrumental to the exploration of conquest of sovereign land and to the construction of power, borders, trade, and sovereignty until today. The sea is history, as Derek Walcott has written. And today, 90% of global trade is still done with ships. 70% of the oil consumed globally goes through the ocean. 98% of digital communication is made through underwater cable. The increasing privatization of water is tracing a new cartography of political and military power, where the alliance between military and science is growing. How will we decolonize and denationalize the white, masculine, and military of the sea? I turn to Silvia Federici, who in Caliban and the Witch argue that there was a relation between the enclosure of land in Europe in the 16th century and the witch hunt and slave trade, between dispossession, gender, and race. So she described this enclosure, the ending the common and enslaving a common, and witch hunt, disciplining women, and privatizing the land as, a common moment, a nexus. And she sees a continuum with the 20th century round of enclosure that have expropriated millions of agricultural producers from their land, and the mass pauperization and criminalization of workers through a policy of mass incarceration, recalling the Great Confinement described by Michel Foucault. And she concludes that the worldwide development of new diasporic movement, accompanied by the persecution of migrant workers, is reminiscent of the bloody laws that were introduced in 16th and 17th century Europe. But again, Silvia Federici's theory is land-based. She does not look at the common, the current enclosure and privatization happening on the sea. What I mean by that, as you do know, you may know that there is a growing privatization of the sea now, that the border are extending, the national border of the sea are extending. And there is the military are looking very much so at what's happening on the sea and are tracing with science a new form also of extraction, a new form that the sea is not just a surface, it's also very much in the depth. I want to give you some example because I cannot go too much in detail. Let me give you one example, for instance, in terms of the military. The US, we still dominate, they are the first maritime empire, France being second maritime power in the world because of its overseas territory, not just because of its coast in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. They are really something which is really out of our screen when we think about decolonization and colonization and gender and race. But in Washington, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment that work with the Pentagon has written that in a report that modern technology will shrink all the sea and ocean to the size of the Mediterranean. A national zone of exclusivity will expand, creating a no man's land, or rather no man's sea, where both sides venture only at grave peril. After a century in which freedom of maneuver was a norm in naval operation, much of the ocean will be carved up into impassable killing fields. Scientific research, meanwhile, is expanding to provide a recognized interdisciplinary forum to develop the awareness of scientific and commercial opportunity for the exploration, evaluation, and exploitation of resources from the sea, commensurate with the proper requirement for the protection of the environment. The long-standing maritime tradition and the obligation enshrined in international law to render assistance to those in distress at sea is being threatened, as you do know, right there, not far from us in the Mediterranean. It's being criminalized. People who rescue those who are in the sea are said to encourage traffickers who profit from dangerous Mediterranean crossing. So even that is being criminalized. The sea, and we know that the law of the sea were written, in fact, by European power in 17th and 18th century. They were not the law, what is called the international law, was written, in fact, by the European power, but has been, again, also expanded now in the 1980s by a new convention that that expanded the power of the United States over the sea. When looking, as I was saying, I'm come from Réunion Island. When you look at the Indian Ocean, it's a very heavily militarized ocean. There is no possibility of looking at it without thinking what is the military and science and capitalism is doing that and how it's transforming the ocean. It's not just an empty space, a space of freedom. The space of freedom, the sea as a space of freedom, is the masculine narrative, Western narrative of the young man going at sea. In fact, in the Indian Ocean, you have more and more now military bases, the biggest one being Diego Garcia, which was taken by the United States. And the population was exiled in Mauritius Island. The island has become a major launch pad for the US attack on Afghanistan and Iraq and supports some of the largest US warplanes. There is, a submarine base now to the island arsenal. In the meantime, so this heavily ocean in which 70% of the oil, the global oil, is going through, is being also militarized by China and by India. There is therefore a moment in which a population, marginal population, will be locked in on the land and the sea and will be effectively under the control of multinational. This is not just, when I'm saying that, this is not just a fantasy. I'm very concerned by the way in which we may have followed also when there was all the story of piracy in Somalia, how the military intervened, and how the fact that Somalia has been destroyed as a country by US invasion was put aside. So we may think that this as happening is marginal or very much, but I do think that it's a new form of enclosure, dispossession, and colonization, and form of extraction that will have meaning for those of us who live inland. So the view of the planet that has been pushed that was in the mind of slaves, but has also been in the fight of some indigenous people, that there is no, in fact, separation between the land of the sea. There is just the same space that continue, that there is a continuum. And that also, for me, has to be reappropriated. The way in which borders are being challenged at land, this border also has to be challenged on seas. As we do know, there is borders, new borders being drawn on the Mediterranean to criminalize effective circulation. And our focus on the border and the question of visa make us perhaps forget what is happening on the sea and how they are becoming heavily militarized to protect trade, international trade, global trade, and also to protect military interest. So when looking at that, I was, how to transform this question. And of course, for me, it was to transform, as Cedric Robinson said in Black Marxism, to have a new theory, we need a new history. And how to make a black history of the sea, a black geography of the sea, a decolonial history and geography of the sea. The theory of black geography offers a method for rewriting the history of the sea from the, I quote, from the vomit of slave ship. To Catherine McCritrick, who is one of the important theorists of black geography, I quote, black geography are what Frantz Fanon described as the history of historical racial schema and the bodily or corporal racial schema. These two concepts advance how place, space, identification, and history collapse to inscribe the black body at racial order. In Demonic Brand, McCritic also argued that, I quote, vessel of slave trade expose a very meaningful struggle for freedom in place. The ship is the location of black subjectivity and human terror, of black resistance and black possession. So if we take from Sylvia Wynter the idea that black matters are spatial matter, and if we look at water as one of these sites and as a space-making practice for emancipation, we can look at the importance of the sea for geographical imagination of emancipation. It's a radical framework for envisioning liberation, social justice, and reconstruction. The forthcoming of a passage through the North Pole, facilitating trade in the East and the West, the politic of privatization, militarization of the sea, the threat to coastal community worldwide raise the question of a new theory of the sea from a decolonial point of view. Forgetting the sea will mean also forgetting where we are and where we stand and how we are being colonized and enclosed. So, for me, it's not just to write the history of the sea as a new alternative history, as a forgotten chapter, but to look at the sea as belonging to the history of the oppressed and thus to the theory of liberation from oppression. Thank you.
So I think in the introduction I said that in the way you weave stories by excavating these forgotten or misremembered histories, you make us see the past more complete, and then you made the point that you are not going to be complete. Nevertheless, in reading your work, there's this incredible, just now, like in the way you bring so many moments and cases, stories together, there is this sense of an immense sort of eruption, I would say, of worlds, which is, yeah, thank you for that. But in response, talking about the sea, I just had a thought that over the Christmas holiday, I was in Cambodia, as I mentioned earlier, and in Phnom Penh along the river, every 5 minutes there would be these barges hanging really, really low in the water, transporting sand or soil down every 5 minutes, another boat, and in the other direction, the boats coming back empty so you could see the boats more. They were raised above the water. And then last week, I was in Singapore at an event talking about the sea, and there was an exhibition by Charles Lim, Singaporean artist, about land reclamation in Singapore. And he told a story how in Singapore, through this immense increase of of land through sand, first from Indonesia, then from Vietnam and other countries in the region, who have all closed down the sale of the soil. More recently, that now the sand is being exported from Cambodia to Singapore to increase the cityscape. And just in the sense of kind of a fragmented add to a story, I thought I could start kind of throwing that at you and see.
I really wanted to take, the famous sentence of Derek Walcott, "The sea is history," as really said. So not just as a past, because he's talking in Homeros about the slave, the slave ship, but what it meant today to talk about it. And also, I was so surprised for so long that anti-colonial thinker or post-colonial thinker never talk about water and the sea. I mean, we talk about water like drinking water. That's a big issue that is being very much discussed at, by NGO, feminists, indigenous people. But the sea and the ocean is as if we have left it to masculine, to the men, to white men. Even when you visit maritime museum, and I do, and even when they are in Macau and Hong Kong, they tell you the story of captain and, fighting against the sea and sea monsters, and also trade, but as a narrative of a free market trade and bringing, and bringing people together. And it's and we do know that the sea has enormous meaning in rituals and memories and of people being displaced or coastal community, but they are not brought. They are part of ethnology or anthropology or, of course, literature and poetry, but they are not brought into theory. So that was, my question. It's usually seen as a geopolitical issue. Is China? What is China doing? How many submarines? Whatever. It's not seen as effectively a decolonial, feminist decolonial issue. How are we going to, effectively, as if we do not know how to do, we know how to do with the land, and the land remained the place to, from emancipation and in anti-colonialism to recover the land taken by the settlers. And we talk even borders and perhaps erasing the borders or crossing border more freely. But how the way, and since we mostly travel by plane, we forget the sea and the importance of the sea, not only for trade, but in the story of oppression and right now, there is a whole theory in Washington and elsewhere that more and more the wars will be fought from the sea, because you will avoid bringing the troops on the land, so you will have mostly by plane and taking off and bombing. So how do you do an analysis of a new imperialism if you don't look at what's happening and the kind of technological advance, the kind of way the sea is being thought as a site to be appropriated by the military, by science? And science also, the huge issue for science that we don't see because we look also so much as what is happening on land. So that, for me, it's how we're going to reconnect the decolonial theory that are land-based with a decolonial theory that integrate the sea and the ocean as space to decolonize and to denationalize also. Because they are nationalized, the sea are nationalized. Mostly, they have this part which will be American and the other part. And this has been imposed totally. This is coming straight from a European political theory of 16th, 17th century.
And seabed mining being the new resource extraction frontier, and the dividing up of the deep sea
and most of trade is still done by ship, not by air, not by train. So how can we going to fight against capitalism and consumption if we don't look at the way in which, at the mean of transportation and how they are carrying? The railway was a very important tool for imperialism, and the ship maybe, the new tool of the new form of imperialism. I mean, they were already, ships were very important to transport workforce, bonded workforce, or even indentured workforce afterwards. But how they, what role do they play in the making of the world today?
Mm-hmm. Another story I wanted to share in conversation is that on that same trip, we went to the Spice Islands for the first time. I do a lot of work in Indonesia about oil palm monocultures and so on, but we went to the eastern part, and so in the Spice Island, the Moluccas, there's one volcano coming out of the sea, Ternate, where the cloves come from, which was 500 years ago the island where the Portuguese and the Dutch fought each other over the spices, the cloves. And visiting one plantation of the sort of what they say the oldest trees remaining from that time, we were told that for 3 years now there was no more harvest of the cloves, which then makes you think that the kind of colonialism, climate as a colonial project, through the reason for this is being climate change, erratic weather, the season's not working straight anymore. And so that the climate change comes full circle in that history of colonialism on the sea, in the island archipelago.
Slave trade and colonialism were a very important point, for the progress in maritime industry and maritime circulation and navigation. Ships have to be made, faster, better. There were a lot of progress, technological progress on the sea was also connected with the economy of slavery and colonialism. The British invented very fast ship to go to China and bring back tea. And that was connected also with the imposition of opium. So the progress, I mean, because if we have to look at the way in which production and consumption are racialized, gendered, and based on exclusion, expropriation, dispossession, I think that for me, effectively reappropriating the story of the sea as not just historically what ship did that, but how it was important to map them out so they became invisible to us. So that effectively we are, for those who thought about decolonization. The sea it's almost another country.
It's another entity. It's alive. A question that I have been wanting to ask in terms of the racial capitalocene terminology, which now doesn't really fit anymore, perhaps, but I still would like to come to that. The other term often raised in that context is the plantational scene. Of course, that also has the sea is implicated in that, obviously, as a transitionary relation to the land. But I wanted to know if plantational scene, how you would respond to that in relation to the racial capitalocene.
Yeah, it was one of the expression of racial capitalocene. Yeah. I mean, the plantation, the mine also, because don't forget that the mines were extremely important at the beginning. The silver mines for the Spanish and also the mines remain very important. So extraction and plantation. I mean, extraction of from the earth or extraction of work from bonded labor both were part of this organization. But for me, I mean, the question, for instance, just saying Anthropocene or Capitalocene, like forget effectively the racial dimension, which is always also gendered, always. So I want to insist on that because I don't think, I really agree with Cedric Robinson that there is no capitalism without processes of racialization.
Right. Shall we open?
Yeah.
Yeah? So we said before that we take 3 questions at a time. So Françoise is going to collect and respond to you guys in kind of a clustered manner. So you're welcome to let me know who would like to ask. And then there are 2 microphones here and there. And we make a kind of an order. It's a bit hard to see. And maybe you're still shy. Someone there? There's some.
Hello, and thank you very much for your work and sharing with us today. I have a question regarding tactics as activists and scholars and artists present. I was wondering if it comes from the sense of powerlessness that you mentioned. I recognize this as well also as an activist and artist, wondering what can we do or what space is there to intervene in institutions that continue these pervasive patterns. So I was wondering if you have practicalities as well when it comes to, for example, the effectiveness of the interventions you've done in the Louvre. And we're in a museum city and many of us collaborate with museums. What kind of pressure points and agendas would you like to see pushed as allies?
More questions?
To begin with a sense of powerlessness, my thinking would not be, to repress it as, oh no, we should not feel powerless, that's bad. I think that is important to go through it to see what makes us feel powerless, what really, of course, we feel that there is a huge machine, advancing regardless of what we do, but that's not true. I think if there is so much repression today and so much, because there is, when we see how power responds to even small, what we see as a small action is really that how much they don't want dissent. But so the sense of powerlessness, first, I will say that it's not something that we should be ashamed of or reject. It can be, but what do we do with it? What do we do with it? I was at a meeting with Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles in December, and the room was full of young women. And Angela Davis was speaking. And the question that came back, and which is partly an answer, was like, what are your practices of self-care? That you cannot take care of people if you don't take care of yourself. But it was not New Age kind of, let's do yoga all together. It was really, how do you effectively protect yourself from the constant stress of capitalist aggression? And I thought it was very interesting for me, who have been raised more in the sense that activism is almost, you don't count your hours, right? I grew up seeing my parents constantly fighting day and night, Mondays through Sunday, and practically no vacation, and constantly, and in a situation of constant repression, the police are in the house, threat, jail, and everything, and so this idea that you never stop, you never, never give up, never, And of course, that's very important, I think. That's very important to never give up. But at the same time, how do you also create spaces that in which you can rest. And so I think for me this discussion was very interesting about this young woman, this young black woman in Los Angeles who are effectively confronting incredible brutality of racism. And otherwise, I mean, they're also organizing. One of the things also I've been organizing a lot, I mean, practically, it's every year I do that with 30 to 40 artists in France. Coming from the Caribbean or Africa or Maghreb, I mean, people, I mean, not necessarily foreign, but living in France, but coming from this former French colonial empire. It was also, it's related to this question of powerlessness, because I was constantly hearing from them that if they had that, they could do that. Or if finally Beaubourg was opening its door, it will be better. And I was telling them that even when Beaubourg will open the door, we will be frustrated because it will be on the way Beaubourg wants to open its door, so it's not going to be that much fun. And so it was, how do we start from an economy of what we have rather than what we should have? And that if we had that, we will be able to do that. And so one of the things we did in 2016 was called Cartography of the Post-Colonial Space. And we had a huge gallery between two exhibitions, so it was an empty space. And I asked everyone to bring an object that they thought would be related to represent the post-colonial space. So it could be an object, a book, an image, whatever, music, whatever. And the first day we put that in, all of them in the middle of the room. My idea was like to say, if we were putting all of us, our memories, the language we speak, the poetry we know, the book we have read, the theory we know, so many things, it will be in fact a lot. And this is not made visible even to us. We forget what we have. We have been built, you know, we have school, university make us forget who we are and what we have. Everything is. So if we make it visible even for ourselves, and it's not, you know, about a chapter which has been forgotten, it's about us. And so and the idea that I do every year, and last year we did something else also, is can we, another principle, can we realize collaboratively something in 2 days? So it's not the photographer will show something and the conceptual artist will show. Can we all together build something together, a show? And the third thing, it has to be ephemeris. Has to on the second day of the night, it disappears. We don't want also to get into, okay, that's going to be an exhibition forever and the discussion. So these things are just experimentation and small practices to also put together and see what are the obstacles, how do we forbid ourselves to do something, what are the how we self-censor ourselves, where is the self-censorship in this space. This is a place in which you don't have to prove yourself, you don't have to prove that you are the next fantastic artist. And so that was experimentation, that other experimentation. I mean, there is this thing, Le Louvre, and right now I'm doing something at the Musée de la Croix around Orientalism, and which is from starting with Edouard Said's book, of course, on Orientalism. And it's, of course, with Delacroix, a fantastic painter. And so it's not so much to say Delacroix was an Orientalist, bad Delacroix, but also to look why did he go to Morocco? When was that? How did he do that? Which is not told in the museum. The museum, he went to Morocco in 18 so much, but what was happening? Why did he go to Morocco? Because you had the French colonial conquest, and that made it much easier for a lot of French artists and writers to go to the Orient. So it's telling the story of the connection for a whole generation of artists in France to meet the Orient because there was a colonial conquest. And the relation, and also to tell the story through that. So we have reading of a very important writer, Balzac, Flaubert, Nerval of the time, showing their fascination with the Orient, and there is never an interest for the people they meet. Never. Never they wonder who, I mean, they go through Algeria, they go through Morocco, they describe everything, they describe very well, they say, they don't say necessarily mean things, but they never see. So how invisibility, I mean, how this is constructed. So for me, doing this guided visit is also to see how do we now, how this is still constructed in ourselves, how are we made to not see? Because they were not seeing, and this is Delacroix, this is not a minor painter. So these are the things, one of the, it's, but when I say that, it looks like, oh, it's easy, so it's not. It's not. It's a lot of effort and a lot of. It's going against a lot of things. It's going. You have to be ready. You have to be ready. And I think it's worse. It's worse now. It's really. I think it's worse because you have racism without race now. That's very strong. You don't need, I mean, the idea of race has disappeared, race as a biological thing. But racism without race is very strong. Very, very strong. So I am not racist, but it's very, very, very strong. I have a black friend, but, you know, I do think that nonetheless black people are inferior. I mean, this is very, very, so this is for me there where I have to intervene in this question of racism. And I do see also feminism without women coming. A lot. A lot. So that my activist intervention now, how to intervene against racism without race and feminism without women.
There's another question there. Yeah.
Yes, hello, thank you so much for being here. Going off a bit the same topic, I had a question. I was really interested when you were starting out, you talked about this matrix between the exploitation of, or the exploitative forces of gender, race, and capitalism together. And, you know, with the story, for example, of the Bulgari Watch and this thing, which I completely see the connection between the exploitation there. But I also wonder how can we go ahead in a system in like the capitalist system that we live in now, where the exploitation from that is so ingrained in everything that any sort of popular movement will take on also these exploitative elements of capitalism. So anything fighting for gender or race equality will also take on aspects of that. And can we afford to not push on those other fronts until we move from capitalism into something else? Or is there a way to use the exploitative forces of capitalism for these other things? Or like, how is that tension? Is there a way to resolve it?
I have my answer in my mind, and now I have forgotten, so let me... Okay, there was also, you know, at the beginning when I started to think perhaps we have to rethink the way we fight and what our objective. I mean, this vocabulary of turning point, defeat, victory. I think we have to rethink it first and work differently toward that. I do think also we are... What I think is very interesting, because I'm very interested in the fabrication of consent, because I don't think I can think what is dissent if I don't understand how consent is fabricated. And effectively, for instance, when I look at feminism, because feminism, I mean, I'm interested in feminism, and I've been looking at it very much more even recently. Last year I wrote a book about 1,000 of abortion, forced abortion and sterilization in Réunion Island at the same moment when the women's liberation movement in France was fighting for free abortion and contraception. And they did not make any relation between the two, even though they knew, because the scandal was so huge that it was reported in national newspaper then, in Le Monde, Nouvel Observateur. So I started to look at that and why even some of the Gisèle Halimi, who was a very important lawyer, had come to Réunion almost, to defend the woman, and then it did not happen. And then 2 months later, there was a manifesto of 343 women declaring publicly that they aborted. There was not a word anymore. So I'm interested in that, how the colonial racial disappeared totally from social movement, a social movement like the liberation of women's movement, especially the women's liberation movement, the colonial racial disappeared. Why do we move from liberation movement to women's right, to the discourse of women's right? Liberation movement, women's liberation movement, of course, there was the echo with national liberation movement. So I'm interested effectively of this movement, the fact that some people who will never say they were feminists can say they are feminists now, or what Sarah Faris has called a femonationalism, or effectively also the way in which gay rights are reappropriated by imperialists. And so all this I think it's newer than it was 25 years ago or 20 years ago. It's very, 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 I think this is where effectively sometimes perhaps the sense of powerlessness or the sense of, but how can we say something that nonetheless cuts through? Because after all, it's as if as soon as we say a word, it becomes totally it fades, in the force. But I do think at the same time that it remained very strong. It's some words remain very strong. And so for me, it's like to look when they remain very strong and they remain very radical and they put the fear in the power that be, and to encourage that. And perhaps also we are in a moment where we will want perhaps to have like a strong force that we say, okay, this is it, okay, and to put the dream in the Arab Spring. Oh no, it's not working, bad. And so we have perhaps also to give up that and rethink how movement will be done. But the other thing also, sorry, I look perhaps confused. The only thing also, I do think that right now we have to think together a lot because there are so many things happening, both from the ground, a lot of things from the ground of people protesting, a lot of things are re-emerging, being strong. And so we have to be much more, we have to rethink, okay, how indigenous people are saying that, oh, black feminists, Afro-feminists are saying that. So how do we look like that? How do we circulate? How do we not trying to have like a meta-narrative, but at the same time we do know that there are movements we find. I do think that anti-racism, political anti-racism is really now also the fight. That there is something about the question of race in Europe that has not reached really its radical moment. I really, that anti-racism and racism being always connected with sexism, it's both, is to struggle together. I do think, I mean, the left in Europe or elsewhere for that matter is absolutely not looking at that question. So this is why for the work of the black radical tradition has to be, to me, revived in the sense of that how race has been really an organizing principle and how we will fight, what kind of anti-racist struggle we're going to start. And so how do we think the abolition of certain institutions also that go with that? I think it's the idea of Angela Davis of abolition of prison is very powerful. This is practically impossible to think, impossible to say, okay, we have to abolish the prison because prison have been a racial institution. And I do think that's also, how do we rethink, how do we bring back an utopian dimension to thinking, not building utopian community, but utopian thinking. And last year in this workshop I do with artists, it was to think, it was to rethink utopia. And we started by, I mean, the idea was, okay, utopia as when everything looked natural, like day and night, like slavery looked like day and night, you know. It was, the church was for it, the law was for it, culture was for it, the economy was for it. So it looked like, you know, the day, the night, the sun. It was like a mechanic. But it was really like that. It was really like that. And the slave who fought back, or the maroons, say, no, that's not natural. So it's how you denaturalize also something, and you dare to think that's no, it's not natural, even though you know that the fight is going to be long. So today, how we denaturalize, you know, what seems totally, for so many people, natural, and has been naturalized, and race has been really naturalized, as culture now is a new word for race. It's my culture is being, you know, threatened by foreigner or whatever. Culture is a new word for race. And so I do think rethinking race is very interesting. You know that I was rereading Balibar and Wallerstein, Race, Class, Nation, because it's the 30th anniversary of the publication this year. And it's incredible how, so it was published in early 80s. It's incredible how this question of the question of racism as central to the question of class and nation was already being alluded to, analyzed. And I think this has to be really, really, again. And so, no fight back against feminists who say that foreigners are sexist and bringing back and threatening women's rights, fighting against, you know, any form of racism as a political issue, not as a moral issue. Racism is not about people who are backward, are not educated. Racism is really how the world has been structured politically.
If there's one more question, we can take a quick one. Otherwise, yeah, good? One more?
Well, I want to thank you for coming, so many people, and I want again perhaps to apologize for some of my fragmented sometime presentation. But it's, I see it also as a conversation with you, not necessarily as a whole finished work, and to really throw some ideas that perhaps we will have another opportunity to discuss, or you can discuss. But thank you very much.